The One and Only Cynthia Jane Thornton by Claudia Mills. Copyright 1986. Chapter 5. On Friday, Mrs. Solomon made an announcement. Next Friday, they were going on a class trip to the planetarium at the Science Museum. It was to be an all-day outing, and they could either bring their lunches or buy them at the museum cafeteria. She passed out permission slips for the parents to sign, giving one to Lucy, too. Cynthia couldn't help being excited. She loved class trips. Travel was important for an author, people said, and Cynthia could believe it. Trips were full of interesting new experiences to write about. When Mr. Taylor had taken them to the art museum last year, Cynthia had written 6 poems in one day. But on the way home, as she waited for Lucy outside the ladies' room stall at Burgerland, Cynthia began to feel more and more annoyed that her sister was coming too. It wouldn't be the same with Lucy there. Here, Lucy emerged from the stall and handed Cynthia the day's clothes to be divided up between their knapsacks. Cynthia shook the wrinkles out of the blouse and began folding. "Who are you going to sit with on the bus?" she asked when she'd finished. She had meant it as a warning. Don't think you're sitting with me, because you're not. But because she felt guilty about leaving Lucy stranded, without a friend in the entire 5th grade, her voice had come out high and mocking. "I don't care. With anyone." Lucy sounded small and brave, and Cynthia felt even worse. But she couldn't have Lucy sticking to her like a shadow all day long. "You could probably get out of it, you know. The trip, I mean. You could say you didn't want to miss all your other subjects." "Are you kidding?" Lucy was so surprised she stopped halfway out of the ladies' room to stare at her sister. "Not go to the planetarium? How can an astronomer not go to the planetarium?" "Well, so long as you understand that I want to sit with my friends on the bus, at lunch, the whole day. If you do go, you're on your own." "I know," Lucy said, so meekly that Cynthia felt like one of Cinderella's wicked stepsisters. As the day of the class trip grew nearer, a disturbing thought gnawed its way into Cynthia's mind. If she wasn't going to sit with Lucy on the bus, who was she going to sit with? Meg and Joanne? But you could only sit 2 to a seat, and they might want to sit together. On Tuesday, while Meg was getting a drink of water after gym, Cynthia turned to Joanne and asked, in what she hoped was a breezy, casual way, "Hey, you want to sit together on the bus when we go to the museum?" Joanne looked embarrassed. Well, Meg and I were planning, but maybe you could sit right across the aisle from us." "Sure," Cynthia said. She felt embarrassed too, not because Joanne couldn't sit with her, but because of the way Joanne had said it. When a person acts embarrassed to tell you something, it makes you feel you should be embarrassed to hear it. Maybe there would be some extra seats on the bus, and Cynthia could sit alone, right across the aisle from her friends, the way Joanne had suggested. But if Lucy was sitting alone too, it would look strange, as if the Thornton sisters were so unpopular that no one would sit with them. They wouldn't even sit with each other. Or maybe, the best possibility of all, Mrs. Solomon would assign partners. That would solve everything. Cynthia wouldn't have to feel guilty about abandoning Lucy or be left out herself. Meg and Joanne might each get assigned to someone awful, like George, who picked his nose, or David Denoyers, who cried whenever he got one wrong on the spelling test. Cynthia viewed that possible outcome with calm satisfaction. Of course, she might get George or David herself, but at least she'd know that it wasn't her fault. It would be, there was a phrase she had heard for it, an act of God. But when Mrs. Solomon collected the last of the permission slips on Thursday, she reminded the class that everyone had to have a partner. "I'm letting you choose your own partners this time," she said. "Anyone who doesn't have a partner should report to me at bus time tomorrow morning, and I'll match up the strays." Match up the strays? What a way to put it! Not that Cynthia could think of a particularly graceful way of saying that anyone who was too pathetic to find her own partner would have a partner found for her by the teacher. She had to pick somebody, unless everyone but her and Lucy had been picked already. Boys were out of the question, so Cynthia let her gaze sweep around the room, resting on all the girls. She'd ask Melissa Hartman, she decided. She had avoided getting too friendly with Melissa, but she was honest enough to admit that the only thing she had against her was that Melissa's stories and poems got read aloud almost as often as her own did. She'd sit next to her during reading group and ask her then, so no one else Meg and Joanne, that is, would hear in case Melissa rejected her too. When the fast group was called, Cynthia hurried to the front of the room and slipped into place beside Melissa. "Hi," she said. "Hi," Melissa said. "I was wondering." This was hard. Imagine having to ask someone to marry you. "Do you want to sit together on the bus tomorrow?" Melissa's face lit up. She nodded, as relieved as Cynthia at no longer being astray. So only Lucy was left. That's what big sisters were for, to take care of little sisters so they wouldn't be left without a partner on class trip day. Cynthia had failed as a big sister. She dreaded asking Lucy if she had found a partner. She knew the guiltier she felt, the meaner she'd sound. But Lucy volunteered the information herself. "Valerie Vlastos picked me," she said, as they were splitting an order of French fries at Burgerland, "to sit with her tomorrow." "That's great. She's nice." Actually, Cynthia hardly knew Valerie. All she knew was that Valerie was the quietest girl in the class. But Lucy was quiet too, so they'd probably get along perfectly. Now Cynthia could die happy. At least she could stop feeling guilty. On the morning of the trip, Mrs. Thornton called them for breakfast an hour earlier than usual. The bus was scheduled to leave at 7:30, and the children were to assemble on the playground at 7:15. School ordinarily began at 8:30, and that they would be halfway to the city before the first bell rang made the trip seem even more of a marvel. The sky was overcast, and as they hurried along to Burgerland, a light rain fell softly. It was still dark enough that the street lamps were lit, and the headlights of passing cars shone dully through the drizzle. Tiny raindrops nestled in the stray wisps of hair around Lucy's face and stung Cynthia's cheeks and eyelids. In Cynthia's knapsack, next to her folded blue jumper and notebook, was the bulging sack that contained her lunch. Lucy had one just like it. In honor of the class trip, the girls had packed their own bags, each one stuffed full of all kinds of special treats: a chocolate frosted cupcake and a ripe, juicy pear, an extra fat peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and a small can of grape juice. Walking along with the rain in her face and such a lunch in her knapsack, Cynthia thought, "Right now, this minute, I am perfectly happy." The tour bus was waiting outside the school when they arrived. Mrs. Solomon was counting off names. "Hi, you two," she said. "Are you sitting together?" "No, we have our own partners," Cynthia said gratefully. She saw Melissa standing alone, reading a book in the light provided by the bus's headlights. She held an umbrella in one hand and the book in the other, flipping the pages with a practiced thumb. When Cynthia walked over closer, she could see the title, Anne of Green Gables. Cynthia felt a keen spark of kinship. Melissa loved the same book she did, loved it enough to go on reading in the dark, in the rain. "Isn't it wonderful?" she wanted to ask. "Have you gotten to the part where Anne breaks her slate over Gilbert Blythe's head, or where Josie Pye dares Anne to walk the ridgepole?" But the spark was snuffed out in a surge of jealousy. Anne of Green Gables was her special book. Anne was, to use Anne's own words, a kindred spirit, someone Cynthia would like to have as a best friend. Melissa had no business loving Anne, too. "Have you read it?" Melissa asked hopefully. Cynthia shook her head. "Oh, but you'd love it, Cynthia. Anne's even a writer and everything. You see, she's an orphan, and Matthew and Marilla adopt her by mistake, and then—" "Well, don't tell me what happens," Cynthia said crossly, "in case I read it." She waved to Meg and Joanne across the parking lot. "Can we sit with Meg and Joanne? They want me to sit across the aisle from them." "Sure." Melissa hesitated. "If you're going to be talking to your friends, well, can I have the window then? I'm writing a story about a bird flying over the harbor at sunrise, and I want to see what the skyline looks like in the early morning." Cynthia nodded, so annoyed she could hardly keep her voice from showing it. "But it won't be anything like sunrise when we get to the city. It'll be practically 9 o'clock, you know, and you won't be able to see anything in the rain." "Anne would say that gives more scope for imagination," Melissa said, laughing. Cynthia said nothing. "All right, kids, we're all here, so line up with your partners and let's get going." Mr. Solomon motioned to the bus door, which had been sprung open to receive them. There was a great scramble to be the first in line, since all the boys wanted the long seat at the back of the bus, farthest from Mr. Solomon's watchful eye. "One at a time, boys," the teacher called out. Muttering to Melissa, "I'll save you a seat," Cynthia pushed her way through the crowd until she was right behind Meg and Joanne. She turned around to see how Lucy was faring. She and Valerie were bringing up the rear, but it looked as if they didn't care which seats they got. They were so busy talking. The two quietest girls in the class were talking a mile a minute. In a moment everyone was settled. Meg and Joanne had picked left-hand seats halfway back, and Cynthia had grabbed the empty pair directly across from them. So at least one thing had worked out right. She stowed her knapsack carefully underneath, so her chocolate frosted cupcake wouldn't get stepped on. It was an hour and a half's ride to the city. Cynthia went on a trip to the city 2 or 3 times a year, and the ride always seemed so long that she was in awe of her father for doing it every day. But the ride had never seemed longer than it did that morning. Melissa made a couple of tries at conversation and then lost herself again in Anne. Cynthia would have given anything to have a book of her own, but she couldn't read on a bus without getting sick to her stomach. Maybe she shouldn't have rebuffed Melissa's friendly questions. The time would fly if they were comparing lists of favorite books or sharing poems and stories. But Cynthia's heart had clamped shut where Melissa was concerned. Being friends with Melissa would be too much like being sisters with Lucy. Cynthia didn't want to be two peas in a pod. She wanted to be the one and only pea, with a pod all her own. She already had friends anyway, sitting right across the aisle. But the bus rumbled along noisily, and it was hard for Cynthia to hear what Meg and Joanne were saying. Something about Doug Meltzer, she gathered. They had called him yesterday after school and pretended they were taking a survey for Fruit of the Loom. Cynthia leaned across the aisle. "What did he say?" she asked. "Who?" Joanne answered for both of them. "Doug." "When?" "When you called him yesterday." "Oh, that. He knew it was us. He said, 'Come off it, M and J.' He calls us M and J." They both laughed uproariously, the way Cynthia and Lucy had laughed at things at home. Just as other people never knew why she and Lucy were laughing so, Cynthia failed to see what was funny about being called M and J. She would hate being such a twosome with someone that people lumped their names together. On the other hand, if her two best friends were M and J, C didn't want to be the only one excluded. The bus gave a sudden lurch, and Cynthia's stomach lurched with it. Sitting sideways to talk to Meg and Joanne made her feel the movement of the bus more. "I have an idea," Meg called to her as the bus bounced over another hard bump. "Go up and tell Solomon you're carsick, and they'll stop the bus." "They can't stop the bus just 'cause one person's carsick." "If you act like you're going to throw up, they will." Meg grinned wickedly. Cynthia shook her head. Some of Meg's ideas were better than others. "Or you could run back and steal the boys' lunches. Doug has his on the overhead rack." "And then what?" "We could see what was in them. You know, like what kind of sandwich." Cynthia had zero interest in what Doug Meltzer's mother had packed for her son's lunch. "Why don't you do it?" she asked. Meg stared. She looked as mad as if Cynthia had stolen her lunch and thrown it out the window. "Okay, be that way," she said. She whispered something to Joanne. Joanne laughed. Then the two of them started talking about a movie they had seen on TV one afternoon after school. For all the attention they paid her, Cynthia might as well have been invisible. The rain had stopped, and several shafts of sunlight streamed down through the thick gray clouds. The sky looked fake, like a Sunday school picture of what heaven is supposed to look like. "Melissa, look!" Melissa glanced up from her book and gasped with pleasure. At that moment they caught the first glimpse of the city's spires. Both girls reached simultaneously for their notebooks. Cynthia wrote in hers, "Sunlight streaming down transforms the city spires into a glimpse of heaven." The last line had too many syllables to be a proper haiku, but at that moment it didn't matter. She almost forgave Melissa for having a notebook of her own and wanting to be a writer too. She laid down her pencil and turned back to the window. But the light had already changed and the picture of heaven was gone, except in her notebook, where she'd have it forever. Chapter 6. Cynthia didn't get a chance to talk to Lucy until they met in the planetarium gift shop at the end of the day, but she could tell her sister was having more fun than she was. To watch Lucy and Valerie together, you'd think they had been friends from the cradle, or maybe best friends reunited after a long separation. And the planetarium itself was so wonderful that an astronomer like Lucy must have been beside herself with happiness. The best part had been sitting in the darkened auditorium, watching the constellations march across the bowl-shaped sky overhead, accompanied by the most joyful music Cynthia had ever heard. The music of the spheres, the narrator called it. Mr. Solomon told them later it was water music by the composer Handel, who was born 3 centuries ago. Afterward, there had been other fun things to see and do. You could step on a scale that told you what you'd weigh on Mars or the moon. You could sit inside an actual size model of a space capsule and pretend you were an astronaut. Cynthia had done all these things, but her heart wasn't in them. She had felt friendlier toward Melissa after the magical moment at the end of the bus ride, but every time Melissa scribbled something else in her notebook, some of the friendly feeling faded. Meg and Joanne were so busy trailing Doug and Andy that they hardly bothered with the exhibits, and Cynthia wasn't about to follow any dumb boys around, especially Andy. She found Lucy poring over astronomy books in the gift shop. "Are you having fun?" she asked. "Oh, yes," Lucy said. "I wish I had more money, though. I wish I could buy every single book here. And those charts over there of the northern and southern hemispheres, and the space capsule pencil sharpener." "How much are the charts?" "$4 each. And Mom just gave us $6 together to buy souvenirs. But I have $2 of my own, too." "Listen, you can have my share of the souvenir money. You can get both charts then." "But what about you? Don't you want anything?" "I already have my souvenirs," said Cynthia loftily. "I wrote 4 poems." "You're sure?" It was lovely to feel so generous. "Uh-huh." "Valerie!" Lucy called across the gift shop. "I can get both charts!" Valerie dashed over to them, her arms heaped high with her own purchases. She was a small, thin girl with dark shoulder-length hair and dark eyes. Cynthia had never thought Valerie was particularly pretty, but now Valerie's eyes were sparkling and her normally sallow cheeks were pink with excitement. Cynthia left them to ooh and ah over all Valerie's souvenirs and went to stand outside alone. There was time to write one last poem before the bus left at 2 o'clock. She watched 2 fat pigeons squabbling noisily over an abandoned ham sandwich. This poem would be a political commentary. 2 fat pigeons fight bitterly over a scrap of bread. It seems so trivial to us. But what do we fight over that is more important? Mrs. Solomon would like this one. Anti-war poems were her favorites. For dinner that night they had packaged macaroni and cheese, the kind with thin little tubes of noodles and a bright orange sauce. Cynthia couldn't tell if it was a step up or a step down from frozen pot pies. Mrs. Thornton was in a light-hearted, merry mood. Michael Bailey had been out sick for a week with chicken pox. "His poor mother," she said with sympathy. "Oh, but it's been nice not having him there. All week long I felt like a teacher instead of a circus trainer." Cynthia was disappointed in her mother for feeling that way. She had been hoping that her mother would admit that, whatever its other advantages, a week without Michael was a lot less interesting. "Do you know what the temperature is on Neptune?" Lucy asked. "Go on, just take a guess." "It's cold," Cynthia said. "1,000 below zero." "That's too cold," Mr. Thornton said. "Absolute zero is only -459. How about -300?" "Close, -370. And guess what it is on Mercury? That's the closest one to the sun." 500 degrees, Mr. Thornton guessed. 620. Cynthia was impressed, not by how hot it was on Mercury, but that her sister knew how hot it was. But of course an astronomer would be brimming over with facts like that. "Wow," Cynthia said happily, "that's hot." "What did you buy in the gift shop?" Mrs. Thornton asked. Lucy looked inquiringly at Cynthia. Their mother wouldn't approve of Cynthia's giving her share of the souvenir money to Lucy. She wouldn't like it if Lucy had 2 star charts and Cynthia had none. "We each bought a star chart," Cynthia said. "Lucy got the northern hemisphere and I got the southern hemisphere." Cynthia could hardly have given an answer that her mother would like better. Even Mrs. Thornton would think it was ridiculous to have 2 charts of the same hemisphere, so the souvenirs were about as similar as they could be. "Do you want Daddy to put them in your rooms?" she asked. Cynthia hesitated then. Lucy would want both charts hanging on her walls, and Cynthia didn't want either. The charts couldn't hang in the tower room since it had too many windows. They should really be together, Cynthia said. Why don't we put them both in? She acted as if she were thinking it over. Lucy's room? What will you put up in your room then? Nothing. Her mother looked dissatisfied. Maybe we'll pick out a poster for you in that little store downtown. Cynthia started to say that she liked her room better the way it was. Lucy liked to be surrounded by shoeboxes full of rocks, stacks of yellowed newspaper clippings, seashells in a jumble on her bureau top. Cynthia liked her room plain and simple, almost bare, like a Japanese haiku, as she liked to describe it. But some things were hard to explain to her mother. Maybe by the time they were shopping downtown, her mother would have forgotten all about it. The drizzle that had begun on class trip day turned into full-fledged rain on the weekend. Cynthia liked rainy Saturdays as much as she liked sunny ones. She woke up early but didn't get out of bed. Instead, she snuggled down more deeply under the covers and recited poems in her head. Her two favorites were Barter by Sarah Teasdale and In Flanders Fields by John D. McCrae. Mr. Taylor had encouraged them to memorize poems, and Cynthia had memorized more than anyone else in the class, including Melissa. Lying there in her dark, cozy room, Cynthia stuck out her tongue. So there. Breakfast was a nice surprise. Blueberry muffins, homemade ones, with blueberries they had picked last summer in Vermont. As the wonderful nutty smell drifted upstairs, Cynthia felt a new surge of joy. It seemed that every day something happened that made her feel she had never been this happy before in her whole life. But almost immediately afterwards something would happen that made her feel she had never been as miserable. Lucy smelled the muffins too. She stuck her head in Cynthia's doorway, and Cynthia made room for her on the bed, scooting over so Lucy could lie next to her. Lucy lay with her head at the bottom, propped up on Cynthia's extra pillow, and her feet at the top, with half of Cynthia's blankets folded back over her legs. Both girls gave exaggerated, hopeful sniffs of the muffin-scented air. Yesterday was wonderful, Lucy said. I really like Valerie. Do you think someone can be your best friend after just one day? Why not? She wants me to come over after school next week. Cynthia didn't say anything. She certainly didn't feel like trailing around after Lucy and Valerie, but Lucy couldn't go if Cynthia didn't go too. But listen, what if I went off with Valerie and you went off with Meg and Joanne and afterward we said we had done something together? Cynthia had to admit it. Lucy was a genius. We'd have to come home at the same time, though, Cynthia pointed out. And we'd have to change first, don't forget. We could meet at Burland, like at 4:30. And one of us would call home to tell her? Cynthia asked. What if she wanted to speak to the other one, the one who wasn't there? She won't. Lucy had an answer for everything. The plan did sound very easy. The only complication would be keeping their story straight. And lying was wrong, of course. But it was such a little lie. It wasn't as if they were lying about going off and murdering somebody. The plan left Cynthia with a funny feeling, though. That was it. She had looked up the word the other day. It gave her a foreboding. Girls, breakfast! Flinging back the covers, they bounded out of bed and ran downstairs for muffins. After school on Monday, Lucy headed off with Valerie, talking furiously all the while, and Cynthia ran to catch up with Meg and Joanne. Hi, M and J, she said, slightly out of breath from running half a block. Guess what? I can come over today. Just me, not me and Lucy. Meg and Joanne exchanged a look. Meg shrugged, and then Joanne said, Oh, great. Cynthia, not being blind and deaf, could tell that they weren't thrilled at the prospect of her company. Part of her wanted to stomp off in a huff, but it would be too embarrassing to act as if she noticed their lack of enthusiasm or cared. Besides, it was natural that they'd have gotten used to playing together without her, since she and Lucy always walked home alone. They'd get used to being the threesome soon enough. She fell into step beside them, trying to think of something to say. Which house is Doug's? It's on the next block, Meg said in a low voice. When we get there, just walk past it like you don't see, okay? Which day does his mother do the laundry? Today, I think. Meg stifled a yelp of laughter, and Joanne's shoulders shook silently. They reached the curb and crossed the street. It's the brown house on the right, 3 houses up. Joanne's mouth barely moved as she gave out this information. Cynthia tried not to look as if she was looking, but she couldn't help being curious about the house that provoked such a reaction from her friends. It turned out to be an ordinary split level with neat low shrubs in front and a basketball hoop hung over the garage. In the backyard she caught a glimpse of a laundry line flapping with freshly washed clothes, but she couldn't tell if any underwear was drying there or not. Apparently Meg and Joanne had better eyesight than she did, since they both exploded into screams of laughter and began running as fast as they could to the next corner. They collapsed on the grass, weak from laughing. "Did you see it?" Meg finally gasped. Cynthia nodded. She had seen something, and for all she knew it had been Doug's underwear. Suddenly Meg stopped laughing. "I have an idea." Cynthia's foreboding deepened. "Why doesn't Cynthia run back and steal a pair?" She and Joanne were goners, rolling on the grass and clutching their stomachs. Cynthia managed a feeble chortle. It wasn't that she really minded stealing Doug's underpants. The deed would require a certain amount of daring, and she knew she'd be treated as a conquering heroine when she returned. But she just wasn't fascinated about underpants in the way that the others were, and she was getting tired of having Meg boss her around. She knew Meg would be furious if she refused to steal them, and that was what hurt and bothered her the most. Stealing Doug's underpants was the price she was expected to pay to be allowed to play with the two people who were supposed to be her best friends. "We'll wait here," Joanne said. No one had even asked Cynthia if she wanted to go. She hesitated, then slowly got to her feet. "Yay!" they cheered her on. "Go, Cynthia!" She started to walk back to Doug's house. She'd steal the underwear, toss it at Meg and Joanne, and then go off alone and never try to be friends with them again. In front of the house next door, she stopped to plan how she'd do it. The 2 yards were separated by a row of squat, plump evergreens, each big enough for Cynthia to hide behind. Bush by bush, she could work her way back to within a few feet of the laundry line. Then she'd have to run for the rest, hoping Doug's mother, or worse, Doug, wasn't watching at the wrong moment. Before she could lose her nerve, she scooted past 5 or 6 bushes to the critical spot. She wished she could carry the last bush along with her for camouflage. She had seen a children's operetta once where the singers crept along holding bushes in front of them. Maybe even a branch or two would help. But now she was being silly. Sternly she surveyed the clothesline. Sure enough, there was underwear aplenty. Big white underwear for Doug's father and smaller white underwear for Doug. His mother must have done hers in an earlier load, or by hand. Wait! There was the blue pair. That was the one she'd get or die in the attempt. The moment was perfect. The yard was empty. Cynthia counted to 3 and then shot out from behind the last bush, leaped for her prize, and sprinted back to shelter again. The whole thing hadn't taken 20 seconds. A dog, chained somewhere, she hoped, began to bark frantically. Cynthia's heart pounded in her ears, but clutched tightly in her sweaty hand was Doug's lone pair of blue undies. Bush by bush she crept back to the road, then ran back to Meg and Joanne, holding her booty behind her back. "Did you get them?" Joanne asked breathlessly, reading the joyful answer on Cynthia's face. Savoring the moment, Cynthia slowly held the pair of blue underpants forward for all to behold. It was worth it. Meg and Joanne, who had stood up to greet her, fell back on the ground, screaming, crying, laughing all in one. Cynthia forgot to be mad at them for making her go. Now that she was included in the joke, Doug's underpants seemed funny to her, too. Relief made her giddy, and she laughed till her sides ached. "What will we do with them?" she asked then. "Will he know it was us?" "Probably," Meg said. "Will his mother call up to get them back?" Meg looked slightly worried. "I don't know, but I wasn't the one who stole them." Cynthia felt her heart pounding in her temples again, this time from anger, not excitement. "It was your idea, though." Meg ignored this. She was busy thinking about something else. A blissful smile played around her lips. "Is this perfect or what? Cynthia can wear the underwear to school, on her head." Cynthia didn't join in the laughter this time. "No, forget it. I won't." "I'll tell Doug who stole them." Cynthia turned and walked away, just kept walking, past Doug's house to the next corner. She half expected them to run after her, begging her to come back, apologizing. But instead she heard, for the 100th time that day, gales of their stupid, stupid laughter. She hated them so much that she could hardly see. Her heart had swollen so that it filled her whole chest, filled her head, too, hammered against her eyes, her ears. By the time she reached Burgerland, her heart was back in place again, but it was so hurt and sore that it was all she could do not to cry. She looked at her watch. 4:15. She still had 45 minutes to get through somehow before she could meet Lucy and change and go home. Counting out enough nickels and dimes, she bought a small root beer and took it to an empty booth in a deserted corner of the restaurant. Only 5 minutes had gone by so far, 40 to go. It was hard not to be angry at Lucy, too. After all, it was her bright idea for each of them to go off with their own friends. Not that it was such a bad idea in theory. It was only what normal sisters everywhere did all the time. The only catch was that Cynthia didn't have any friends. She had thought that she did, but she didn't. For the first time, her mother's rules didn't seem so ridiculous. She found herself thinking, "It's not fair that Lucy has a friend and I don't. It's just not fair." She took another small sip of root beer and crunched on a half-melted ice cube. 35 minutes more. Outside the window, rush hour traffic streamed by, and Cynthia began counting the cars. She'd count to 100 before she looked at her watch again. 55, 56, 57, she counted. 58, 59, 60. Chapter 7. Mrs. Solomon cleared her throat and adjusted her glasses. She picked up the top paper from the sheaf of student poems lying in the middle of her desk. Cynthia stared straight ahead, trying not to show any expression, but her pulse was racing and her palms were damp. Mrs. Solomon read the title, In the Fog. Cynthia went limp with relief. She should have known by now that Solomon always picked her poems to read aloud, but each time she waited with the same mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The teacher began to read. The fog is silent like a tomb, filled with dreary, dreadful gloom, and filled with fate of dire doom. The fog is dark with secret sorrow, it holds no promise for tomorrow, and never, never hope shall borrow. The joys and sorrows of today are quietly, quietly borne away, and gone is all that is cheerful and gay. In the fog, in the fog, in the fog, in the fog. It gave Cynthia goosebumps to hear it. Mrs. Solomon was a wonderful reader, and as she intoned the dark, brooding lines, Cynthia could almost forget that she was the one who had written them. The class had read some of the poems of Edgar Allan Poe, and really, Cynthia couldn't see that his were any better. Solomon read the last 4 lines perfectly, too. Cynthia had printed each repetition of "in the fog" in smaller letters than the one before. The teacher had made her voice softer and softer as she read them, until it faded into a whisper. After an appreciative pause, Mrs. Solomon said, "That was lovely, Cynthia," and Cynthia felt everyone turn to look at her as she blushed scarlet. The next poem Solomon read wasn't very poetic, but Cynthia had to admit it was funny. It was called Why I Don't Have My Homework. I lost it. The wind tossed it. My sister stole it. She made a hole in it. My cat chewed it. My dog doo-dooed it. And it's gone. It was by Andy, of course. The class went to pieces when Solomon got to the line about Andy's dog, and Solomon laughed too. That was one of the good things about Solomon. Some teachers wouldn't read aloud a poem that had the word doo-doo in it, but Solomon said the only thing that mattered was whether or not it was a good poem. "Okay, class," Solomon said then, "pipe down." She picked up the last poem she was going to read and waited until they were quiet before beginning. This one is called Flight. Wings fluttering, feathers trembling, breast quivering, birds against a gray sky. Fly. Cynthia felt a thrill of pleasure, followed by a stab of pain. The poem was perfect. It was the best poem she had ever heard, and she hadn't written it. "Thank you, Melissa," Mrs. Solomon said softly. That was the end of the reading aloud for the day. Solomon got up from her desk and began handing back the papers. Cynthia saw that the teacher had written "beautiful" across the top of "in the fog," but she didn't care any more. It wasn't beautiful, not compared to "flight." The two poems couldn't be mentioned in the same breath. She walked to the cafeteria by herself at lunchtime. She hadn't spoken to Meg and Joanne since she had walked away from them on Doug's street corner yesterday afternoon, but they had started giggling when they saw her that morning. During lunch she sat alone, reading A Little Princess while she ate her sandwich. At the next table Melissa read through her lunch, too. Cynthia wondered if Melissa had read A Little Princess, and if so, whether she thought it was as wonderful as Cynthia did. It would be fun to take turns reading aloud some of the saddest and most thrilling scenes. Sarah, the pampered heiress, befriending Becky, the scullery maid. Sarah, now destitute, defying cruel Miss Minchin. If flight hadn't been so perfect, Cynthia might have stopped by Melissa's table for a minute, just to see what she was reading. But she still smarted from comparing Melissa's poem with her own. At least Lucy wasn't going off with Valerie after school. Cynthia had told Lucy that it would be risky to go off with their own friends too often. So, like every other day would be all right? Lucy had asked. Cynthia had looked worried. Maybe twice a week. Maximum. So today she and Lucy walked home together, the way they always had, stopping to change in Burgerland along the way. And then at home they sat together upstairs in the tower room, Lucy reading The Stars, and Cynthia copying poems into her special book. With each poem she copied, Cynthia felt a little happier. She had written 27 poems in the last month, practically one a day. Mrs. Solomon had written beautiful across the top of In the Fog. The lady at the Northridge bookstore had wrapped her book in violet-covered paper for the poet. Things were going to be all right. Reluctantly, Cynthia agreed that Thursday would be a good day to go off with their friends again. She couldn't bring herself to admit to Lucy that only one of them had any friends to go off with, so she pretended stalwartly that she would be spending her afternoon with Meg and Joanne. After school that day, Cynthia watched Lucy rush away with Valerie, then turned her footsteps in the opposite direction. She had decided she'd go to the public library, just 2 blocks from school, and get a head start on the mythology project they had due in November. Once that idea had come to her, she had actually looked forward to an afternoon alone. She loved the children's room, and the librarian there, Miss Haynes, seemed to have read every book in the world. She was the one who had told Cynthia about Some Day You'll Write, and she was always finding science books for Lucy. The afternoon was raw and chilly, with the threat of rain before nightfall. It was getting dark earlier every day, a minute earlier, as Cynthia's father had said, and the lengthening shadows outside the library made the bright, warm children's room look even more inviting. Cynthia hung her jacket on one of the low hooks by the door, and laid her notebook on the freshly sharpened pencils on an empty table by the window. Then she went to browse in the mythology section. For the project they had to have 6 myths, no more than 2 from any culture. In addition to Greek and Roman myths, they could use Norse myths, American Indian myths, ancient stories from Egypt and the Far East, anywhere. They could tell the myths however they wanted, as long as it was in their own words. Cynthia was planning to write hers as 6 different plays. If the plays were good enough, maybe Mrs. Solomon would let the class act them out. Maybe she would even invite the parents. And at the end of the performance she would tell the audience that the plays had all been written by Cynthia Jane Thornton, a remarkable achievement for a 5th grader. Miss Haynes stopped by her table as Cynthia was frantically copying down the story of Icarus. In the Greek myth, Icarus tries to fly on enormous wings that his father has fashioned out of feathers and wax. But when he flies too close to the sun, the wax melts and Icarus plunges to his death in the Aegean Sea. In Cynthia's play there would have to be some kind of wires hooked up for the flying, as in Peter Pan. But Mrs. Solomon could worry about that part. "You're working hard," Miss Haynes said with a smile, pointing to the untidy heap of papers already covered with Cynthia's large scrawl. Cynthia nodded happily. "My hand aches from writing so much. They call that writer's cramp." Cynthia tried out the expression. "I have writer's cramp." It sounded very glamorous. "I'm glad you came in today. I have some exciting news. Ellen Ketterson, a local children's book author, is coming to the library a week from this Saturday. Have you read any of her books? I'm putting them on display in the showcase by the front door." "I read The Secret Summer. It was pretty good. She's coming here? Your teacher will be telling you all about it in school. She'll be doing a story hour for the little kids, and for you bigger ones, she'll be talking about what it's like to be a writer. So come with plenty of questions. Oh, and she's quite noted as a teacher of writing, too, so I'm asking all the teachers to send me their best student work to show her. She's promised to give some comments. Cynthia knew she wouldn't be able to work any more that afternoon. She began gathering her paper and pencils to pack away in her knapsack. If a real author read her poems and liked them, then she'd know for sure that she was really, definitely going to be a writer. Miss Haynes understood. It's exciting, isn't it? But what if she doesn't like mine? Oh, Cynthia, she's just one person, Miss Haynes said, suddenly serious. But I think you'll have fun talking shop with her. Cynthia hurried to Burgerland. She could hardly wait to tell Lucy. That was one of the nice things about Lucy. She got as excited for Cynthia as she did for herself. If only a real astronomer would come to visit next. But the trip to the planetarium had been a special treat for Lucy, the way this would be a special treat for Cynthia. Of course, Cynthia hadn't been excited for Lucy then. She had tried to talk Lucy out of going and left her all alone to find her own bus partner. Cynthia passed over these unpleasant thoughts as quickly as she could. It had turned out well in the end. After all, if Lucy hadn't been left alone to find a partner, she wouldn't have ended up being best friends with Valerie. This time Cynthia had to wait only a few minutes, and as soon as she saw Lucy, she blurted out the news. She'll think your poems are the best. I know she will. I do, Lucy said. Cynthia did too. She quickened her footsteps home, her cramped fingers eager to curl around a well-chewed pencil. On Friday, to her great relief, Cynthia suddenly had a friend again. Meg was out sick with the flu, so, astray her now herself, Joanne fell in step with Cynthia on the way to the cafeteria. Both girls were glad enough to pretend that nothing had happened. They sat together and talked, just like old times. At least if old times had been very boring. Did anything ever happen with, Cynthia lowered her voice, Doug's underwear? No, Joanne said. She sounded discouraged. Meg still has it. I don't know if his mother even knows it's gone. So much for that. What other topics were there? World events? Weather? Sports? Baseball? Who's going to be playing in the World Series? Either Detroit or Kansas City. Against either St. Louis or Cincinnati. The playoffs are on right now. Joanne hesitated. Do you want to come over after school and watch them? Sure. It was ideal. With the ball game on, they could be friends without the effort of talking to each other. I just have to tell Lucy. Cynthia tapped Lucy on the shoulder. Can I talk to you a minute? Lucy waited expectantly. Valerie waited too. Alone. When she had dragged Lucy away from the table, Cynthia told her about the playoffs. Is that okay? Can you do something with Valerie? Lucy looked so pleased at the thought that Cynthia was half sorry she had told Joanne she'd come. Then Lucy's face darkened. But is it too often? We did it yesterday, too, and that's 3 times this week. It'll be okay, Cynthia reassured her. 4:30 at Burgerland. Cynthia had forgotten how much fun it was to watch TV at Joanne's. There were popsicles in the fridge, and they each had 2 as they curled up on the big leather sofa in the den. The game was a close one, and Joanne cheered and moaned at every home run and missed catch. Halfway through, Joanne's grandmother brought out a bowl of popcorn. If Cynthia and Joanne had really liked each other, it would have been perfect. What do you and Valerie talk about all the time? She asked Lucy on the way home. Things, Lucy said. She didn't mean to be evasive. She meant everything. Do you ever watch TV together? Lucy thought for a second, trying to remember if all the tremendous fun she had had with Valerie had included watching TV. No, not so far. Once we made puppets out of paper mache. There was an article in a magazine that told how to do it. Yesterday we helped her older sister rake leaves. Oh, and we're writing books. You're writing an astronomy book? No, a book, with a story, a real book. Lucy said writing books as if writing were an activity on a par with puppet making. She didn't seem to notice that Cynthia didn't say anything in response. In silence they walked the last block home and emptied the day's clothes from their knapsacks. But when Lucy went upstairs to the tower room, Cynthia didn't follow. She stayed behind in her bedroom and sat motionless on the edge of the bed, staring out the window without seeing. Chapter 8. Lucy writing a book! Cynthia could hardly imagine anything her sister could do that would count as a deeper betrayal. And Lucy hadn't even sounded sorry. How would she like it if Cynthia started reading astronomy books and memorizing constellations? Cynthia might do it, to show her. She'd take up astronomy. She'd shine at math so that they'd promote her 2 grades and send her to take math and science at the junior high school. She'd steal astronomy from Lucy just the way Lucy had stolen writing. I'm the writer, Cynthia said over and over again to herself, fighting back tears. Writing is my thing. Without even taking her shoes off, she got under the covers and lay there, rigid and stiff like a frozen turkey drumstick. She lay there until dinner time, and by then she had decided what she would do. What she would do was to put an end to this business of Lucy and Valerie writing books together. What's your book about? She asked pleasantly, as she was drying the dinner dishes for Lucy to put away. Mine's about a poor little blind girl who lives in London. Valerie's is about the blind girl's sister, who's deaf. The sister lives in Paris. How much have you written? 3 chapters. We work on them at lunchtime. Cynthia dried 2 more plates. A poor little blind girl who lives in London, she said, as if she were turning the idea over in her mind. The whole thing sounded so stupid she hardly knew which part to start on first. Why London? I just picked it. Do you know anything about London? I mean, like, how do you know the name of the street your girl, Elsie, Elsie lives on? We just make them up, and some of them I've heard of. Elsie lives on Drury Lane. That's a real street, I think. You think. Don't you even care if it's real or not? If you're just going to make things up, why not make up the whole city? Why not have her live in Schmunden? Or have her live right here in Northridge? At least you'd have the names of the streets right. I wanted it to be London. But it's not London. It's just a made up city you decided to call London. Valerie and I think it's London. Cynthia wanted to say that there was nothing that impressed her less than what Valerie thought about this or anything else. But she left the setting and turned to other aspects of the so-called book. Have you ever known anyone who was blind? She already knew the answer, but she waited for Lucy to say it. No. Or poor? It's a made-up story, Lucy said. She was obviously beginning to get the idea that Cynthia was mad about it, and that made her mad too. The whole point of a made-up story is that it's made up. You write poems about fairies tiptoeing to breakfast. Have you ever seen a fairy? Or your fog poem. The fog is silent like a tomb. Have you ever seen a tomb? How do you know if it's quiet or not? I've been to cemeteries and they're very quiet. And no, I haven't seen a fairy since no one has. Fairies don't exist. But poor blind people do exist. And there really is a place called London. And you shouldn't write about them if you don't know what you're writing about. Cynthia handed the last plate to Lucy. Lucy banged it on top of the others and slammed the cupboard door. Why did you ask about my book if all you wanted to do was make fun of it? She demanded. Cynthia gave Lucy a serene smile. You figure it out, the smile said. Even though Cynthia knew Lucy was taking her bath, she waited for a long moment with her ear against the tower room door. Then she sat down on the window seat next to Lucy's heap of schoolbooks. She studied them carefully, without touching a thing, so that she'd be able to put everything back exactly as she found it. The 5th-grade math book was on top, and a stack of loose papers was sandwiched between the spelling workbook and Lucy's notebook with the stars on the cover. Gingerly, Cynthia lifted the math and spelling books off the pile, surprised to find her heart thumping. One glance at the top sheet of paper underneath told her she had found what she was looking for. Elsie, she read, by Lucy Jean Thornton. The story began on the next page. Elsie was a poor little blind girl who lived in London long ago. She was an orphan. Her mother and father were dead. She had no brothers and sisters except one sister who was deaf and lived in Paris. Elsie had to wear rags because she had no money to buy any clothes. She ate crumbs of bread people left for birds. As if the birds wouldn't have snatched up every one, Cynthia thought disgustedly. In the winter, Elsie almost died of the cold. She made a fire out of old sticks she found in the gutter. How did she start the fire? From matches people had left for the birds? The story sounded an awful lot like The Little Match Girl by Hans Christian Andersen. Only the little math girl wasn't blind. Cynthia kept on reading. The book, none too cheerful to start with, got sadder and sadder. Elsie had a precious possession, a silver locket that her parents had given her at birth. A pickpocket stole the locket one night while Elsie was sleeping. That part sounded sort of like Little Orphan Annie. Then in chapter 2, Elsie made friends with a poor stray orphan dog who brought her sticks for the fire and helped her get the breadcrumbs. That part was a lot like Little Orphan Annie, too. In chapter 3, a rich man came along, and you could see a mile away that he was going to turn out to be some distant relative. Each chapter was 2 or 3 pages long. It certainly was a short book. Cynthia didn't see how you could call something a book that was probably going to have 15 pages total. She shuffled the pages a little so the pile wouldn't be too neat. Then she laid it back on top of Lucy's astronomy notebook. She replaced the other books just as she had found them. The tower room door, which always stuck a little bit, burst open, and Lucy came in. Cynthia jumped. She hoped it didn't look like a guilty jump. Lucy looked at her as if she thought it was a guilty jump. "The stars are shining beautiful this cold autumn night," Cynthia said with wide-eyed theatrical enthusiasm. Chapter 2 of Elsie had begun, "The stars were shining beautifully that cold winter night." "I'm glad I'm not blind, aren't you?" she went on in the same starry-eyed manner. "It would be awful to be blind, with nothing to eat but crusts of bread left for the birds, wouldn't it?" "You've been reading my book," Lucy accused her. Cynthia feigned surprise. "Your book? Oh, that's right. That thing you and your little friend Valerie are working on." In her desire to make the project sound as ludicrous as possible, she demoted Valerie mentally to fourth-grade status. "Did you know that technically something has to be 100 pages long before it counts as a book? If it's shorter than that and you call it a book, it's like cheating." Lucy snatched up her pile of books and papers. "I don't read your things," she said, "and you shouldn't read mine." "Don't worry," Cynthia said. Her voice was so cruel and jeering it sounded like someone else's. "A little bit of Elsie goes a long way." "I hate you," Lucy said, her voice trembling. "If you hate me, then why do you copy everything I do?" With that, Cynthia swept majestically out of the tower room. But all that meanness hadn't used up any of her anger toward Lucy. She was just as angry when she was getting ready for bed, and for a long time she lay seething under the covers, too angry to sleep. It was the clearest, crispest, brightest weekend of the fall, and Cynthia was miserable for most of it. Instead of hopping out of bed first and beating Lucy to the vacuum cleaner, she burrowed deeper under the covers and ignored the morning light streaming through the lacy curtains. The night before she had planned to get up extra early and toss off a few math problem sets so Lucy could see what it felt like to have someone else steal her special thing. But now that the time for doing them had actually arrived, Cynthia found she had no desire to tackle a big, boring batch of fractions. She supposed she could at least open the book so it would look as if she were fast on her way to becoming an astronomer. It seemed like a big effort, though. It wasn't Cynthia's idea of fun to open her math book before she'd even had breakfast. She looked over at the blue pants and lavender pullover hung neatly on the back of her desk chair. An identical set, one size smaller, hung on Lucy's chair across the hall. The chairs were identical too, of course, and the desk, and the pencil holders on top, pink porcelain elephants with pencil sharpeners in their trunks. But you could always tell Cynthia's pencils were ever in the house she had left them. They were chewed like logs for a beaver's dam and worn down to stubby stumps. Lucy didn't chew hers. What was the point of changing clothes at Burgerland if everything else about them was the same? If Lucy was going to be a writer too, they might as well dress alike and give up correcting the principal when he thought they were the same person. In her mind, Cynthia made a list of qualities that used to set her apart from Lucy and make her special and unique. 1. Talks a lot. 2. Does crazy things. 3. Has a neat room. 4. Chews her pencil. 5. Is a writer. Ticking off the items one by one, she could hardly believe how much the list had shrunk in the past few weeks. Lucy talked a lot too, at least when she was with Valerie. Cynthia was still the girl who threw the window pole out the window, but she had drawn the line at being the girl who wore Doug Meltzer's underwear to school on her head. Doing crazy things wasn't as much fun if people only liked you because you were a clown. And being a writer was gone too, the most important of all. Cynthia Thornton? Oh, she's that girl who has a neat room and chews her pencils. It was a pretty skimpy total. As Cynthia stared bleakly at the ceiling, she heard the sound of the vacuum cleaner in Lucy's room. Lucy was up ahead of her and busy at her chores. The way things were going, Cynthia fully expected Lucy to emerge from her room later that morning with a great black plastic garbage bag bulging with trash and clutter. Twice a year or so, provoked by their mother, Lucy had a spurt of room cleaning enthusiasm. Here lies Cynthia Jane Thornton. She chewed her pencils. It wasn't much comfort that hers was all but guaranteed to be the only tombstone in the world with that inscription.